All right, so welcome to Philosophy 100C. Empiricists, Pandemic Edition. So I'm not going to go the whole time today because we don't have any reading to discuss, but I'm going to go through the syllabus, go over some, administrative type matters, and then give a brief introduction to the course. If you have questions, I think actually the best thing from my point of view is to unmute yourself and ask the question out loud. If you don't want to do that, you can use the text chat, but I might or might not notice right away that you've done that. So I still have not figured out how to get it to play a notification every time someone does that. So let's see. I want to go through the syllabus. To do that, I want to okay, so you see my browser window? You must. All right, so this is my courses page. It's people.ucsc.edu/Abe-Stone. From there, you can find a link to the syllabus. There's also a link to this recurring Zoom meeting, which is going to be the lectures. And there's a link to this YouTube playlist, which currently is empty, but I'm planning to upload the lectures to it as they're recorded. So now let me go to the syllabus. Okay, so that's me, Abe Stone. You can call me Abe if you want, or you can call me Professor Stone. I'm fine with either one. How to contact me? The best way, well, so I used to say that I put my office phone number on here, but that wasn't a good way to contact me. However, of course, I'm not in my office, so that's not usable at all. The best way is to send an email. Someone might not be unmuted and maybe have a bird on their shoulder or something, a pirate. Okay. So there's still something going on. I think I can unmute. I can mute all. How do I do that? Mute all. Okay. So I muted all, but it allows you to unmute yourselves. So like I said, if you want to ask a question, how do I get rid of this one? If you want to ask a question, you can unmute yourself. I hear you can unmute yourself just by pressing the space key. I've not tested that. But anyway, you can unmute yourself and ask a question. Or make a comment or whatever. All right, so as I was saying, so the best way to contact me is to send me email. I do check that pretty regularly these days, at least a couple times a day. If I'm not responding or it's urgent, I have this thing that I set up a few years ago. I'm not 100% sure it's working now. I should have someone test it. But basically, it's a way you can send a push notification to my phone, and it'll go like doo-doo, and it will say, send me a short message, like read my email that I sent you. Hopefully that won't be necessary now. I set that up some years ago when I was kind of email phobic, but I think I'm over that. Okay. And anything else to mention particular in this section? Okay, well, here's another link to this recurring Zoom meeting. There's a link on the course Canvas page as well. So if you lose the email that invited you, there's at least 3 other places you can get it. This takes you to that page I showed you before with all my courses, with this one at the top. And these are 2 links to my Zoom office hour meetings. Apparently you can't set up a recurring meeting that's not at the same time on every day. So I've made it 2 meetings here. These are your teaching assistants, Sean Hunter and Anna Pedroso. Believe, are you guys both here?
Yes, I am. Hello, everyone.
And I know I already got a text from Sean, so he's here too. Okay, so there are not going to be discussion sections exactly. I mentioned that in an email that I hope you all got, but I'm going to go over it again now anyway. So there aren't going to be discussion sections, but there's going to be something in place of that. And actually, I'm going to talk about that right away. Unless, are there any questions about anything I said so far? Okay, I guess not. Okay, so course requirements. So this is what's replacing the discussion section, or at least the main part of what's replacing it. There's going to be a requirement for class participation, and this is worth 10% of your grade, and it will be by way of the discussions tool on Canvas. By the way, I'm not using the Zoom tool on Canvas. I found that it wasn't very flexible in what it allowed me to do, but like I said, there is a link to the Zoom meeting on the Canvas site. All right, so anyway, this is the discussions tool on Canvas. I have never used it for anything. Maybe you guys have. Right now, there should be nothing there at all, but things will be added. And this is how things will be added. Every Sunday night, the TAs, I believe they're going to take turns doing this, will post a passage from the coming week's reading. And you guys are required to ask questions about it and to respond to each other's questions. And you have until Thursday night of that week to do that. So, and the minimum requirement is to ask 1 question and respond to 1 other person's question. Yeah, as it says here, the questions do not have to be complicated or profound, right? Like, for example, I think a perfectly good question would be, I don't understand what Locke means here. Does it mean X, you know? And then, I mean, if you just say, I don't understand what Locke means here, I think maybe that's not enough. That's kind of too easy to say. But if you have some direction, say like, or some specific thing, does this word mean this or that? Just anything like that. It doesn't have to be, like I said, very profound. And the response to the question certainly doesn't have to be, this is the answer, I know the answer. It can be like, you know, like for example, if that were the question that I just gave, the answer could be, well, I don't know, but he uses the same word over here, and you know, maybe that's relevant, right? You know, just something like that. The intent of this, obviously, is to try to keep you engaged with the text and with each other to some extent as the quarter goes on. And as far as how that's going to be graded, so I said it's 10% of the grade. Basically, if you meet the minimum requirement, so the minimum requirement, like I said, is 1 question and 1 response per week, but you get to skip 2 weeks for each. You know, like no questions asked. So really, it means that you have to ask 7 questions and give 7 responses in 7 different weeks. If you do all of that, and if your TA believes that your questions and responses are minimally engaged with the text, so that they count, then you'll get an A for that 10% of your grade. So that should be an easy way to get an A for 10% of your grade. If you miss more than 2 of them, I'll reduce the grade on some schedule. I guess I will figure out. It will not be draconian, but at least enough to make it worth your while to do this. And of course, I mean, this applies, well, this really applies to everything in any course I teach, but especially this quarter under the weird circumstances we're all working under. You know, if there's some reason that like you can't do it and you already missed 2 and there's another one, you know, whatever, just like get in contact with a TA, get in contact with me, and we'll, you know, we'll work something out. But try to do your best. We're also working under unusual circumstances. It'll be easier, you know, the more everyone can do, the easier it will be. Let's see. So there will not be live Zoom discussion sections. The first version of the syllabus that I put up earlier this week, I guess, said there would be live Zoom discussion sections. I talked that over with the TAs, and we decided that probably would not work well, and that's why I've substituted this text discussion. But the TAs will hold Zoom office hours. So that's completely optional, obviously, but anyone, and I think any student can show up to any TA's office hours. If, you know, if some particular one starts being overloaded, we might have to revisit that somehow. But at least to begin with, you know, show up to any one of these you want. They haven't been announced yet what they will be, because I sent out a Google survey that you all should have gotten. I know some people responded to already, and we'll figure out what the preferences are between the times the TAs have proposed. And there will be live Zoom lectures. Obviously, you know that, or you wouldn't be here. Here's another link to the Zoom meeting. Attendance, I never require attendance at lectures in my courses, so obviously not going to require it this time either. I do highly advise it. I think it's helpful. I hope it's helpful. If possible, I think attending the live lecture would be better. It will certainly be easier for me to lecture if I know that there's someone there. It's really strange for me to talk to nobody. But also, you know, you can ask questions. I think a lot of times people don't understand what I said the first time, but then if I'm lucky enough that someone asks a question, people find the answer to the question helpful. So I encourage that. And obviously you would have to be tuned in live to do that. However, I know that some people may not be able to tune into the lectures live because of bandwidth or because of the time zone you're in, or, you know, whatever, many reasons. So I'm gonna record all the lectures and put them up on YouTube. And if you want, you can watch them there. Again, that's not required, just highly advised. Sean just told me I can turn off the enter leave chimes. That's a good idea if I knew how to do it. Do you know how to do it, Sean? I don't know. I'll bear with them for now because I don't want to start searching around menus. I'm going to get distracted. Okay, so those are the kind of unusual aspects of the course requirements, at least unusual for me. The rest of it is the same that it would always be in this course, except reduced a little bit to allow for that 10% participation thing. Oh, wait, there's one more thing I should say about the text discussion. If you participate a lot. You don't have to stay with the minimum. You may, for one thing, actually find it helpful to talk to other students about the text or about what's going on in the course. But anyway, people who are particularly good participants in that, if there are any, if your grade is near a borderline, then we'll use that as grounds to bump it up. And there usually are quite a few grades near a borderline, actually, the way things work. That's worth trying. And like I said, anyway, you might find it helpful, but that's not required. Okay, so getting back to the kind of usual requirements for the course. So there's these things I have called metaphysics exercises. The reason why I call it that is kind of lost in the mists of history, but it's basically an online quiz, multiple choice quiz. It's not timed. You can do it as soon as I manage to get it up. I change them a little bit every year, or else I would put them up all in advance, but I can't because I'm making them up as I go a little bit. But you can do it as soon as it's up, and usually they're due. So I'll show you. There's only going to be 10 of them all quarter. Some weeks there are none, some weeks there are 2, and some weeks there are 1. But like, so for example, here it says ME number 4 due. So that means that's due at 11:55 on April 27th. And that metaphysics exercise number 4 will be about this material that I lectured about the previous class. So the idea is that it should help you after you've heard me lecture. I mean, you could do it before if I get it up before, but at least you can wait until after you hear me lecture about the material and then read this question and go back to the reading if you need to and try to figure out the answer. I have to say that in the past, these have been extremely difficult. I'm going to try to make them easier, but whether they're easy or difficult, the grading scale for them will be the same, which is that basically it's on a curve. I mean, I put that in quotes because I'm not using a normal distribution or something, but basically the most common grades on that portion are going to be A- and B+. And often that means that, given how hard they've been in the past, that you could get only half of them right and be getting an A-. So I know, like, every time I do this, students panic and they're like, I'm failing, you know, but no, that's not the way it works. As long as, and I believe you should be able to see some statistics about it on Canvas. If you're near the median, that means you're probably getting a B+ or A-. And in the past, no one has failed this part actually, except by not doing any of them. So you should, like, even people who got like 1 point ended up with a C, I think. So you shouldn't be worried that this, even if they are very difficult, that means you're failing that part of the grade. They're basically going to be in the same range as the paper grades. Okay, so that's the metaphysics exercises, and notice that all put together, they're worth 30% of your grade. So you definitely want to do those. Even if you don't know the answer, you definitely want to guess. There's no penalty for guessing or anything. So like, you definitely want to do those. Each one of them doesn't count for very much. Each answer to each particular, usually there'll be 3 questions on each metaphysics exercises. So each one of those answers doesn't count for very much, but when you put them all together, it's 30% of the grade. So you should take it seriously. The other part are these 2 short papers. And for these, the assignments are already up. So you can click on this link. There's a link from the my main courses page too. Well, I won't go through the assignment right now, but that's weird. Why did that? Oh, okay. So each one of these is worth 15% of the grade. These are pretty structured assignments. You'll see they ask you to do like a particular thing. They're not like open-ended essay questions. Then there's one longer paper, 6 to 8 pages. Is that too long? This is a disciplinary communication course, though. Oh, there's a question here. See, as I mentioned, I don't necessarily notice the questions. Will there be reading assignments that are graded? How would I grade a reading assignment? Oh, you mean like assignments about the reading? I guess. I think I already covered that. All right. So the metaphysics exercises are about the reading, and they will be approximately every week. And although the purpose of them isn't really to test whether you've done the reading, I mean, the purpose of them is really to hopefully get you to think about the reading a little bit more. I guess I should say something in general about, actually, let me put that off and finish going through this part, then I'll talk about reading. Okay, so there's this one longer paper. Yeah, I'm gonna leave it 6 to 8 pages. It's due Tuesday of finals week. This is a more open-ended assignment. There's a list of suggested topics. The suggested topics are kind of long and like branching, meaning it's like, you know, there's a lot of different ways you could take the question. Ooh, this has to be changed. It says there will be special section meetings, but there won't be any section meetings. All right, got to figure out how I'm actually going to handle that. But let me just mention, so that the extra component of this paper, and this is because this course fulfills the disciplinary communication requirement, is that a week before the due date, a partial draft of it is due. And the partial draft is a draft of a first paragraph and an outline of the whole paper. So, I mean, you're not like bound to use that first paragraph or that outline that you handed in. But obviously, if you want this to help you write the paper, you should start thinking about what you might want to use. The reason I made this requirement this way is that I find a lot of times undergraduate papers, I'll end up, I get to the end and I'll say, well, you know, that thing that you said in the last paragraph, that should have been your thesis statement. That would have been a good paper, you know. So the idea is that the TAs will have a little bit of time to give you a little bit of feedback. In the past, we've done that by coming to section to get that feedback. Now, this year, like I said, we'll have to figure out how to do it. But so anyway, that's a requirement. It's not a percentage of your grade, but if you don't do that initial draft, then your grade for the final paper will be reduced. So like from A to A minus. So you should do that draft. It says if you don't hand it in at all, or if it is wholly unsatisfactory, that's meant to be a very low bar, right? I just mean like, I don't want people to be able to hand in gibberish and say, oh, I handed it in. But basically, like, it doesn't have to be at all good, but anything that looks like a first paragraph and an outline, hand that in your final grade will not be reduced. But if you don't hand in anything, your final grade will be reduced by 1/2 step. Okay, this already says, I already said, well, you already know this, that there's links to them from this page. Formats to hand it in. Basically, it just should be something that the TAs can convert to Microsoft Word. And you should be able to hand in the paper until the last day of the quarter, even if it's late. Obviously, you may not get full credit if it's late. If you want an extension, you should ask, especially under current circumstances. There's every reason to think you might get an extension, but you should ask. And it's set up, or it should be set up not to allow resubmissions, because that just gets really confusing. But if you made a mistake and you need to resubmit it, contact me and I'll make an exception and you can resubmit it. I just don't want people like submitting constant different drafts and whatever. Okay, all assignments are due by 11:55 p.m. The reason I put that, I used to say all assignments are due by, well, I used to not say what time assignments are due. And then people were like, what time is it due? I was like, I don't know, whatever. So I said by midnight. But then people said, oh, but technically midnight is the first instant of the next day. So does midnight, so I was like, okay, 11:55. But the truth is, I'm not sitting here with a stopwatch. Just try to get it in at the right time. Okay, and as it says here, as I've already indicated, especially given that conditions are strange, we're definitely going to try to be flexible about things. But on the other hand, remember, our conditions are unusual too. It's definitely easier for us if stuff comes in on time and we don't have to worry about it. So please try to do that if you can. All right, are there any questions about this? Anything I've said so far? Okay, required texts are listed here. You should be able to get them through Bay Tree Bookstore or anyone else. I have the ISBNs here. But I also have put links to free versions of the same text. The readings are mostly or all by section numbers and chapter numbers and whatever, so it shouldn't matter what edition you have. You should be able to find the reading. And in particular, you should be able to find it in either one of these. I also have links to LibriVox recordings. For me, I mean, they say learning styles differ. I'm not sure, but for me anyway, it's kind of hard to absorb a text the first time by listening to it. It's fine after, like when I used to drive to Santa Cruz twice a week from Berkeley, I used to listen to the text in my car on the way there if I could. But anyway, if you do prefer to listen to it for whatever reason, these are free public domain recordings. Okay. Are there questions about that? Oh, and Sean told me how to turn off the more meeting settings. I don't see meeting settings. All right, try to figure that out later. Okay. Okay, this is just a list of readings. And first of all, it's to remind me to say what I wanted to say about the reading. So basically, like in some kinds of courses, the reading is kind of an alternative to the lecture. Like in a math course, the same material might be covered in the textbook and the lecture. You could use either one. In some courses, the reading might be kind of like a supplement to the lecture, like the lecture tells you some stuff and you get other stuff from the reading. But in a course like this, the lecture is about the reading. So like that's what we're talking about, what these people wrote. That's what I'm talking about. I know that people don't always do it, obviously, and I'll do my best to make some kind of sense even to people who haven't read it. But the truth is, it's going to be hard to follow what I'm saying if you haven't read it. And there is a fair amount of reading, so and it's not by any means the most difficult philosophy reading in the world, but it's not, all philosophy reading is somewhat difficult, or it's all difficult in different ways, I guess, if it's any good. So yeah, so hopefully you can do that, and you should leave time to do that. And the other thing I wanted to mention about this schedule here, so there's 2 classes that I can't give at the scheduled time because of the Jewish holiday of Passover. So this year, that's really easy to handle. The live lecture will be at a different time. So next week, the live lecture will be on Tuesday instead of Wednesday. And the following week will be on Tuesday afternoon. This week will be Tuesday at the regular time. If you can make that time, great. If you can't, it will still be recorded. Okay, and there's links to the paper assignments here, and that is that. Are there, okay, I mentioned everything on my list here. Okay, so that's the end of the kind of administrative stuff I wanted to discuss. Are there any questions about that before I go on to introduce the course? Okay, so stop sharing this and start sharing.
I think there's a question in the chat.
Oh yeah, what was that? Hold on, I'll get rid of this window. Yeah, was there a question?
Somebody asked a question in the chat.
Oh, a question in the chat. Oh, okay. Is it okay to read an abridged version? No, I would not suggest reading an abridged version. No. And I mean, why would you want, like, the full version is free. So why would you want to read an abridged version? I mean, well, okay. Let me give a slightly different answer. I mean, it's still kind of the same answer, but so I'm not assigning to read all of these books from cover to cover. In the case of Locke's essay concerning human understanding in particular, I'm only assigning a little bit of it. Well, I mean, like, I don't know, a third of it maybe or something, because it's really long. So basically, the assigned reading is an abridged version, but it's abridged by me. So you should read my abridged version rather than someone else's abridged version. I also would avoid, there's floating around out there are people who have translated early modern texts into contemporary philosophical English. I don't think that's a good idea. I would definitely avoid it. In philosophy, a lot depends often on exactly what word is being used and exactly how the sentence is structured. And yes, these people wrote about 300 years ago, give or take. English is a little different. Stylistic expectations are a little different. It's, there's a little bit of friction to push against in reading it, but it's so worth it in order to actually read what the person actually wrote rather than take someone else's word for it. So I would definitely avoid those translated versions if you find those. The links that I have on the syllabus are to, the full text. It's just a free edition on Google Books or Wikisource. Okay, so that was a good question. Are there other questions? Okay, so I'm going to go back to sharing my advanced content from second camera. Okay, I'm still experimenting with the right way to do this. I don't know if this is the right way to do it or not, but this is what I've come up with, that, one camera is focused on this board. So, you'll see my back when I write on it, and then I'll come back here and talk. So I'm going to erase this now. I've ordered a document camera. So it may be that after that comes, I might actually show some passages from the reading on the screen and point to them. To see how easy that is to do. But anyway, that hasn't arrived yet. Okay, so this class, I guess I shouldn't have erased that part. This class is called Empiricists. What does that mean? Well, first of all, although this isn't part of the title of the course, this is part of the title of the people we're talking about, the British empiricists. Here's why we have a course called British Empiricists. For a long time in the history of philosophy, history of Western philosophy, I should say. So the history of Western philosophy started around 500 BC. So if this is 1, 500, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000. So for kind of, so by the way, we have a course called 100A that's mostly stuff around in here. (100B) well, Descartes was born in 1596. So if this is Descartes was born around there. So 100B and 100C, as we'll see, starts a little bit later than 100B. The first person we're going to be reading is Locke. He was born in 1632, so it's, over here. So, and it goes a little bit later than 100B, although they basically cover the same period. Okay, so first of all, most of the history of philosophy is in there between what's covered in 100A and what's covered in 100B and 100C. And in the part of this that's usually called late antiquity and the Middle Ages, so kind of like all of this, philosophy was dominated by a school called Aristotelianism, right? Aristotle himself, of course, lived way back here. He's taught in 100A. He wasn't really dominant in philosophy in the period immediately after his death. It took a few centuries for him to get going as important, but I guess maybe I should put this back for but at a certain point in here, in this period we call late antiquity, these people who thought of themselves as Aristotelians, call them peripatetics, or they call themselves peripatetics, but also people who thought of themselves as Platonists, who we call Neoplatonists, both agreed that Aristotle was really important. And so Aristotle started to become, in that period, the dominant figure in philosophy, even for the quote-unquote Platonists. And as philosophy moved from Greek into Arabic and then into Latin during this period, that kind of Aristotelian Neoplatonic school continued to be dominant. So all these people were Aristotelians. Now, what does that mean? It means they all agree that Aristotle is mostly right, or at least that mostly, if he's ever wrong about something, it's a really interesting and subtle mistake. It's not, couldn't be stupid because he's Aristotle, right? So they agree that Aristotle is really great. However, they don't agree what Aristotle means. So during this whole time, they're all fighting with each other about, number one, what is the true doctrine in philosophy? And number two, what does Aristotle think? And the two are kind of mixed together because for the most part, you want to claim that Aristotle thinks what you do, right? So that was this period of Aristotelianism. Now, there's a lot to be said about this, and when I teach 100B, which I haven't done for a few years, I actually spend a little time at the beginning reading a little bit of this stuff. I'm not going to do that in this course, but I do want to say point out one thing that Aristotle says that therefore Aristotelians agree is true in some sense, which is that Aristotle says human beings need two different powers, two different mental faculties in order to have knowledge. And the two faculties are called sense and reason. So according to Aristotle, in order to know things about the world, we have to, number one, be able to interact with it by our senses. So we have a mental faculty of sensation. And, but also in order to know about the world, we have to be able to think about the results of the senses. That faculty of reason supplies another component of our knowledge. So what happened after this period of the dominance of Aristotelianism ended was that, of course, now people still don't agree with each other, but there is something they still do agree with each other about. Only now what they agree with each other about is that Aristotle is wrong, that we're not Aristotelians anymore. That's, I mean, it's an oversimplification, but it's good enough for our purposes. What they now agree about is that Aristotle was wrong about a lot of things. And one of the things that they agree about in this period up to basically 1781, which is the publication of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. In this period here, which is called the early modern period, right? Whereas this is like the later modern period. So down here. Everyone mostly agrees that we only need one of these, that only one of these yields knowledge. Of course, they know we have the other one also, and they say that it helps us in various ways, but we don't get any knowledge out of the other one. So the only thing is, they all agree about that, but they don't agree which faculty it is we get knowledge from and which is the other one, right? So if you think that the faculty that we get all our knowledge from is reason, then you're called a rationalist. But if you think that the faculty we get all our knowledge from is sense, then you're called an empiricist. So people in this period can be divided into rationalists and empiricists. And they were divided into rationalists and empiricists. And they were divided into rationalists and empiricists by Kant. Kant was the one who decided to structure the history of early modern philosophy this way. And he decided to do it because his big point in this area was to reinstate a version of the original Aristotelian view that we need both faculties. So we need both mental powers of sensation and reason. We can't have knowledge with either one of them alone. So he classified his predecessors by which mistake they made, basically. And it's not a bad classification. I think, is actually a pretty good classification. But even if it were a bad classification, we would probably pay some attention to it because Kant was so influential on everything that happened afterwards. So that's why we have these two courses, 100A rationalists and, 100B rationalists and 100C empiricists. Now my chat window just disappeared. How did that happen? More chat. Oh, right. What did I say Kant wanted to reinstate? Like I said, there must be some way to get it to play that bing sound when something happens in the chat window. That's what I actually want to know. All right. I went into preferences and checked what seemed to be the appropriate box, but it didn't do that. All right. Anyway, right. So what I said Kant wanted to reinstate was this view that we need both faculties. So that both rationalism and empiricism are mistakes, according to Kant. Actually, in some sense, he says they're kind of the same mistake. They've just taken the same mistake and gone two different ways with it. But okay, so anyway, okay, so someone raised their hand. That also doesn't play a sound. It makes a little box appear on my screen that said that you raised your hand. Yeah, I don't know what raising your hand is good for. I know my kids have been doing it in their school Zoom meetings, so it must be good for something. I should probably ask their teachers what to do. All right. Anyway, for now, whatever you need to do to get my attention, raise your hand, whatever. Okay. All right. So we have empiricists and we have rationalists. And then also I added this other thing, British empiricists. Is it okay if I erase the entire history of Western philosophy here now? See, I hate this. I'm really used to being able to ask a question like that and look at the class and everyone goes, okay, you know, or it stares at me like, what are you talking about? All right. I'm going to erase it. Actually, let me write the rationalists on this side and the empiricists on this side. Right, so it further tends to be noticed that at least, I don't know which thing to put first here. There's 6 big names in this. No, I maybe even just start even before that. Actually, yeah, so let me start with this. So this way of dividing early modern philosophers into empiricists and rationalists is division by their views about, erase this too. Epistemology. So epistemology, this word, although it comes from Greek roots, is not an ancient term. And in fact, it was introduced in the 19th century. So after all the people were reading, towards the end of the 19th century, I believe. But it's the word that everyone uses now to describe what I'm talking about, which is philosophical questions about knowledge. What can we know and how do we know it? I should say, I guess, what can we know, if anything, and how do we know it? Right, so that's epistemology. Epistemology goes together usually with another branch of philosophy. This is a more ancient term, although it wasn't used by Aristotle himself, metaphysics. So metaphysics is philosophical questions about what kind of things exist and why they exist, what kind of causes they have, that kind of question. These things obviously have to go together in some way. It have to go together in a number of ways, actually. So like if you make certain claims about what things exist, in your metaphysics, then your epistemology better be able to explain how you could know that. And on the other hand, if you claim that we can know certain things, then your metaphysics better be able to explain what we are and what the things we know about are and how that connection is able to arise between the two. Right, so these things go together. Sometimes one comes first, sometimes the other. I think it is true that in this period, and especially among the people who are classified this way, epistemology tends to come first. First, they worry about what we can know, and then based on that, they try to figure out what kind of things there could be in the world. Because they have to be the kind of things we could know. Otherwise, how could we claim they exist, essentially? So basically, we're classifying people by their positions on epistemology and metaphysics that goes along with it. However, there are other parts of philosophy, in particular, the parts we call ethics and politics, which are about completely different kind of question. What kind of things should we do as individuals? How should society be organized? That is, what's the right way to organize society, or what's the best way? People in the early modern period were also very interested in these questions. All the people reading in this course also wrote about this type of question. If you were to focus a course on this type of question, then it wouldn't divide, the groups wouldn't divide the same way between British and Continental, for example. And in fact, the course I taught last year was about early modern politics. I'm going to teach it again next year. And we went from Hobbes, who was British, to Locke, who was British, to Rousseau, who was French, to Wollstonecraft, who was British. So it went back and forth. But when you organize things this way, the most important names do seem to organize themselves this way. But the empiricists were British, and the rationalists were, well, so here's the rationalists. On each side, there's kind of a big three. right? On the rationalist side, we have Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz as the big three. There's no women on these lists, which sometimes now leads people to not stick with the big three and substitute or add something. But at least traditionally, usually a rationalist course has been about these three philosophers. Descartes was French, Spinoza was Dutch, and Leibniz was German. All three of them wrote in Latin and French. Spinoza wrote a little bit in Dutch. Leibniz wrote a little bit in German, very little, mostly letters and stuff, I think. Basically, all three of them wrote in French and Latin. Those were the learned languages on the continent. And then we have another big three on this side, which is Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, and that's who we're going to be reading in this class. Okay. It would help me, although like I'm only seeing like 3 people here, and I only see their names because they don't have their cameras on. It would help me to sometimes see faces, but I'm not going to ask you to do that because I don't know. You might not want to for various reasons. In any case, what was I talking about? Oh, right. So these are the 3 people we're reading in this course. Let me stop this sharing and go back to this basic. Oops. Back to my browser window. There we go. Usually I write down the dates they lived and then onto my notes and then copy them onto the board. But this time I'm going to short circuit that by just showing you how I would have got those notes, which is by looking them up in Wikipedia. We've got those dates. So Locke, as I said, was born in 1632 and died in 1704. There he is. By the way, these pictures from the Wikipedia articles are the ones I had my daughters draw their own versions of. So there's Margaret's version of Locke. This says butt. I think she thought his chin looked like a butt. All right. So Locke lived from 1632 to 1704. Berkeley, 1685 to 1753, and Hume, 1711 to 1776. So end of the 17th and big part of the 18th century is what we're talking about. So that's why these are the 3 people we're talking about, because these are the big 3 British empiricists, and we divide early modern philosophy based on considerations of epistemology and metaphysics into empiricists and rationalists. Nevertheless, as I said, all these people have something interesting to say about ethics and politics as well. And I am going to spend, in each case, I am going to spend some time talking about those views as well and how they're related to the extent they come up in our readings and how they're related to their views in epistemology and metaphysics. The last thing we read is Hume's second inquiry, is all about ethics. So we're going to end with Hume's treatment of ethics. And I think that's, I mean, these days, a lot of philosophers are very specialized. They do, it's not just that they don't do all of these things, it's that they do only one tiny piece of one little thing. But that's not natural for the field, I feel, and you can see it by reading these people who weren't able to talk about one thing without also talking about the other. So I'm going to try to bring out those connections. Okay, now. Well, maybe actually we'll. No, that'd be confusing. All right, stop share. This is not very. This program leaves something to be desired. You should be able to. Well, never mind. Anyway, okay, so. So when I start talking about Locke next week, I'll start talking more about Locke's life in particular, not that much about it. I'm not, I guess I should say, I'm not a historian. I'm not even a specialist in the history of philosophy or in this part of the history of philosophy, but I'm really interested and I think it's really important. Again, I don't think that whole specialization thing is very good for us, actually. So I'm not a specialist in the history of philosophy, but I'm certainly not a historian. So that is, my interest in these people is basically in like, what kind of questions were they asking? How were they reacting to each other or to past philosophers? What kind of influence did they have on future philosophers? Although I know that a lot, probably the more I know about their life and other things that were going on at the same time and so forth, the more it would help me. I find that kind of part less interesting. So I don't know as much about it, although I learn more all the time, and I'm not going to spend as much time talking about that. But I will spend a little bit of time talking about it when I introduce Locke in particular, some things about his life. But so that will all be next time, and obviously I'll start talking about his particular views next time. The only other thing I wanted to say, well, actually, there's two other things I wanted to say something about now. Okay, so one is, why are the British empiricists British? Or why are the empiricists British? Now, it's not something essential about being British, because actually, right after this period, French philosophy became dominated by empiricism. It's not as if empiricism is like naturally British and people who are French can't be empiricists. In the case of the Continental rationalists, I would even say these people, this is kind of an external label. They didn't think of themselves as continental. They thought of themselves as French, Dutch, and German. But in the case of the British empiricists, well, first of all, they did think of themselves as Britain was like its own separate sphere of doing philosophy. One thing I forgot, I think I started to say this, but didn't give the punchline, which was that these people all wrote in French and Latin, but these people all wrote in English, right? People started writing in English in British philosophy very early. So they're more closely connected to each other because this is the only kind of philosophy that's written in English. But there's certain other things that might make empiricism more dominant in Britain in this period, I think. Although I guess before I say that, I should say one other thing. These people did all think of themselves as British, but they also thought of themselves as English, Irish, and Scottish, right? So Locke was English. Berkeley, of course, Ireland is not part of the island of Great Britain, right? Berkeley, in that sense, is technically not British. He lived in Ireland, but he was Anglo-Irish. He was born in a castle in Ireland. So he was part of the, occupying English nobility of Ireland, and he became a bishop in the Irish, I guess it's called the Church of Ireland, which was the Church of England and trying to impose itself on the Catholics in Ireland. So basically, you can also think of Berkeley as English. And he did spend a certain amount of time in England as well. And then Hume was Scottish. So this is a difference that they were very conscious of. In a somewhat later period of British philosophy, English and Scottish philosophy really diverged from each other. I don't think that's true at this point, but it might be an oversimplification even to call them British. Anyway, that was kind of a digression. I should apologize in advance. I'm famous for my digressions. I'm sorry about that. But so in any case, what are the things that might make empiricism dominant in Britain? Well, first of all, in medieval Britain, there were philosophical differences between medieval Oxford, basically, and medieval Paris, between the English scholastics and the French scholastics. Now, people used to travel back and forth between the two, but still this seems to have been a kind of national difference. And the difference had to do with what's called nominalism versus realism, about universals, and about other things as well. I'll explain what nominalism means in some detail, more than you want, probably when it comes up. It's not directly the same thing as empiricism, but it seems somehow related to empiricism. And anyway, Locke and Berkeley, at least, are fairly strong nominalists as well as empiricists. So that may be something they inherited from. And the names here would be John Duns Scotus. He was Scottish, as you can tell from Scotus, and William of Ockham, the great medieval English and Scottish philosophers, who were both nominalists. William of Ockham was probably the most extreme nominalist. So that's one thing. Another thing, so I'm fairly sure that's true. I'm not sure how important it is. Another thing that I'm a little less sure about, but I think may be important, is that, again, even in medieval Britain, there was some tension between the British Church and the central authority of the Catholic Church, that is, papal authority in Rome. Of course, in the 16th century, under Henry VIII, the British Church broke away from the Roman Catholic Church, formed its own separate hierarchy with the king or queen at the head instead of the Pope. So you might ask, well, okay, but what does that have to do with epistemology and metaphysics? I mean, it might actually have more to do with politics, for example. William of Ockham wrote some pieces about the limits of papal authority and got in some trouble for that reason, had to like go into hiding or whatever. But it has some relevance to epistemology and metaphysics too. And the reason is because of something called transubstantiation. So I just realized that the chat window has disappeared again. Okay, well, I mean, I think there's some way that you can exchange private chat messages with each other. I'm not sure if, like, I mean, it's kind of amusing, but maybe we should like leave the everyone chat for people who actually want to discuss the course material. I don't know, call me crazy, but it seems like that might be more appropriate. I don't know. Anyway, now I've got the chat window there again. Transubstantiation should have two S's in it, but I feel like you write it with one. Well, I don't know. Up to a possible misspelling. This is transubstantiation. Transubstantiation is the doctrine that in the Eucharist, when the two species, the bread and the wine, are consecrated, they literally become the body of Christ. So the body of Christ is actually there. And if the Eucharist is being celebrated in many places at the same time, the body of Christ, the entire body of Christ, is at each one of those places all at the same time. And of course, although the entire body of Christ is there, it doesn't look like the body of Christ. It looks like a wafer, right? So that's the doctrine of transubstantiation. When the Anglican Church first broke away under Henry VIII, actually Henry VIII, so I guess I should say the early Protestant reformers in Germany and elsewhere were against the doctrine of transubstantiation. They said it had no basis in the scripture and it was moreover absurd or whatever. When Henry VIII took the Church of England out of the Roman Catholic Church, at first he maintained the doctrine of transubstantiation. And in fact, anyone who he caught denying transubstantiation got tortured and sometimes burnt at the stake. But pretty soon afterwards, Edward VI changed the Church of England to the more common Protestant view that there is no transubstantiation. So then there's all kinds of different views under that about exactly what does happen in the Eucharist. But the main point is what's there is still a wafer and wine. It's not the body of Christ. It's what it looks like. And like every other body, it's in only one place at the same time. And then under Mary, it changed back to, because she went back to Catholicism and then changed back under Elizabeth. And there was a lot of burning at the stake on all sides. But by the time the people we're reading about were writing, this was all settled. And let's see, how do I do this now? Stop share. Screen. There should be a way to do this with one click. There isn't. Oh, and I see. Actually, every time I stop sharing, it also erases the chat window. All right. Anyway, this is from the 39 Articles of the Church of England. You can say you read it here first, unless you're really interested in Anglican theology. And this is Article 28 of the Lord's Supper, and it says, Transubstantiation, or the change of the substance of bread and wine in the supper of the Lord, cannot be proved by Holy Writ, but is repugnant to the plain words of Scripture, or overthroweth the nature of a sacrament, and hath given occasion to many superstitions. So the Church of England is against transubstantiation. And all good Protestants are against transubstantiation. At least that's what's thought at this time. I think it later became somewhat controversial again in the Church of England, but in any case, well, you might be able to see, if you think about it, how the need to defend or attack a doctrine like that could have an effect on epistemology and metaphysics, right? Like empiricism says the only way we know about the world is through our senses. So, so if it looks like a wafer, it is a wafer. Well, I mean, of course, it might be a painted piece of wax, whatever, but like if it looks like a wafer and is identical to a wafer in whatever way you study it with your senses, then it is a wafer. There's nothing else you could know about it or even think about it, according to empiricists. So empiricism is a very good doctrine for attacking transubstantiation. And on the other hand, rationalism, which says we never know about the world through our senses. So even if it looks like a wafer, but we know it's not, we haven't really been deceived because our senses aren't are never a reliable source of knowledge. So rationalism is a good doctrine if you want to defend transubstantiation. These people actually had some issues with transubstantiation, but at least they started off from a view where it was conceivable to defend it, whereas these people are starting off from a view where it's easy to attack it. And I mean, all this is a little bit, I don't know, maybe reading in too much, except I think we'll notice as we go along that they all do mention here and there as an example of something absurd that someone might believe because of superstition, because of fanaticism, for whatever reason, that the same body can be in two places at the same time. When they mention that, they're thinking about transubstantiation. So it is on their mind. It seems like a weird footnote to us, but in this period, it did not seem like a weird footnote because, as I just mentioned, within living memory, people had been burnt at the stake over this in England. There had been wars fought about it on the continent. It was something that people were thinking about, and therefore it might be worth us thinking about it also. Okay, are there questions about transubstantiation? I'm not necessarily qualified to answer them, but okay, oh, I see people agree with me about the chat, yes. Okay, so there's only one other thing I wanted to talk about, and only a little bit, and then as I said, I hope to finish at least a little bit early today, which is about reading Locke. So Locke is the first of the three and therefore the oldest, and therefore his style is kind of the oldest. His style itself can be a problem for us to read it, I think, at least until you get used to it. You know, when we're taught how to write well, that means, you know, use forceful sentences that, like, with vivid verbs that, you know, get straight to the point and whatever. Well, there's other ideas of what it is to write well, and the one that to a certain extent is still applicable in German, but was at that time applicable in English also, was that a way to write, and it's due to Cicero basically, so it's ancient, that a good way to write is to make your sentence into like a really complicated puzzle, basically, like an elegant puzzle that has to be taken apart piece by piece and put back together to understand it. So you'll see when you start reading Locke that there are these very long sentences with lots of subordinate clauses and whatever. And you may say to yourself, boy, what a terrible writer. But, that's what they thought was writing well. And if you tried to write that way, I think you would find it's not any easier than what we call writing well. But in any case, that's one thing to mention about reading Locke, just so you should be aware of that. Also, just in general, Locke tends to be pretty long-winded. This book, The Essay Concerning Human Understanding, is very long. Like I said, I think I assigned, I don't remember, but it's like only maybe a third of it or something. There's some parts that are really important that I'm sad that I couldn't fit in, but there's other parts that are definitely skippable that I'm happy I couldn't fit in. Yeah, I mean, you'll see his style is like, he likes to beat arguments into the ground. So, like, if his opponent says X because of Y, then he won't, so it'd be enough either to show that X is not true, or to show that Y is not true, or to show that even if Y is true, it wouldn't imply X. But he'll usually do all three, right? So it'll be like, first of all, your conclusion is false. Second of all, your premise is false. Third of all, even if your premise were true, it wouldn't imply your conclusion, right? That's the kind of thing he does. So again, just be warned, that's what you're in for. I think after a while, it can get kind of entertaining if you get used to it. I certainly like reading him more now than I used to. I also find, so I guess this is kind of a hard issue it's kind of nebulous, but there's kind of a feeling going around, so to speak, that Locke is either like not the brightest light on the tree, or kind of nasty, or both. Now, I guess maybe I'll talk a little bit more about this. I'll talk more about the specific ways people think that when we get to them. And as far as him being nasty, I talk about that more in 144 when I teach his political philosophy. I think actually that neither of those things is true at all. I certainly feel like the more I have read him and taught him, the more I've come to feel, of course, not that he's right. Like, no great philosophers are right. I mean, like, as Descartes points out, since they all disagree with each other, like, they couldn't all be right. Most of them have to be wrong, but actually I think they're pretty much all wrong. But we don't read the history of philosophy in order to read things that are right. We read the history of philosophy in order to read questions that are good questions and attempts to answer them that are interesting. And as far as that goes, like I said, I think Locke has my respect more and more as the more I think about him. And I also feel that of the three philosophers we're reading, leaving aside what he was like personally, although I don't know anything about him as a person except one, that goes against this, and the one has to do with his alleged, it's not alleged, it's true that he wrote a constitution for the colony of North Carolina? South Carolina. I think North Carolina, maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, which was enshrined slavery in the constitution of that colony. And it was at a time when African slavery was just getting started. So it wasn't like he was dealing with a fait accompli. On the other hand, he didn't write that for himself. It's a complicated issue. But anyway, as far as, I don't know necessarily about him as a person, but as far as his character comes through from the writing, I find him more likable than most philosophers actually. Um, for example, when he talks about infants, about Americans, as he says, meaning Native Americans, because that's what American meant then, about what he calls idiots, which at that time was not a derogatory term. It was supposed to sound kind of clinical, right? For someone who's cognitively disabled or developmentally disabled. When he talks about people like that, in the case of infants, it's clear, even if we didn't, this is true because he was a physician. I'll mention that next time. But it's clear that he's actually held an infant and paid attention to it, what it's doing, what it's looking at. In the case of Native Americans, he had a conversation with them. I guess, some who were visiting England, he had a conversation with them about numbers, and he reached certain conclusions about the role that the kind of number words we have in our language plays in the kind of concepts we have for numbers, right? So, I mean, we'll see that when we get to it. Also, the main point I want to make is, like, it seems to me that Locke was a person who was genuinely open to people who were different from him, who were vulnerable compared to him, and was like actually interested in what they were thinking. That's only one aspect of it, but I think that's something, I think it's going to be a sharp contrast between Locke and Berkeley in that respect, as we'll see. Okay. And is that important? I don't know. I feel like it could be important to try to understand what kind of person the philosopher you're reading was. But I'm not sure I can explain why. Even if they're writing about metaphysics and epistemology. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say today. Are there questions before we end the meeting? Oh, when are my office hours beginning? My office hours are beginning tomorrow. I didn't have them today, but they're beginning tomorrow. And I didn't set an invitation to those. I could, I guess. I didn't want to spam people with a ton of invitations, but anyway, there's a link to it in the syllabus. Maybe I'll send out an invitation too. Okay, that's a good question. Any other questions? Oh. Okay. Okay, let me answer these in the questions that came in. Okay, so Wayne says, training as a Zoom assistant. Okay, yeah, like if you can let me know how to make it play a chime when someone types in the chat window, I would love to know that. Oh, I see, that was private. Okay, sorry. These were public questions. Quizzes this week, no. The first one is due, the first metaphysics exercise is due well, it says it's due April 7th. I should actually change that to April 8th because there's no reason that needs to be moved for Passover. Okay. Yeah, so it'll be due a week from Wednesday. Will the info I covered today be in any readings? No, because it's just background. The readings are all by these three people, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. There's no secondary readings. And oh, yeah, if you want to chat, do it. That's correct. Okay, well, so as Wayne just said, if you want to chat about the course, you might want to do it on Canvas, then you get credit for it. Yeah, go ahead and set up whatever other thing you want to. Is it okay if I end the meeting now? Okay. Okay, thank you. See you on Wednesday, I hope.